For years, football fans have argued about one question. How do you take David Beckham, Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard, Wayne Rooney, Rio Ferdinand, John Terry, Ashley Cole, and fail to win a single major tournament? Depending on who you ask, you'll get a different answer. Some people blame the managers. Others say England never found the right tactics. Some insist Gerrard and Lampard could never play together. Others point to bad luck, penalty shootouts, questionable refereeing, or simply running into better teams at the wrong time. And here's the interesting part. Every one of those explanations has at least a little truth behind it. But I don't think any of them tell the whole story. Because when you start digging into England's so-called golden generation, you discover something surprising. The biggest mystery isn't why they lost. The real mystery is why we expected them to win in the first place. Today, we're going to investigate one of football's greatest unanswered questions, not by defending a popular opinion, not by repeating old debates, but by examining the evidence, one theory at a time. And by the end, I'll tell you which explanation I think actually holds up. Let's start with the most obvious one, talent, or more accurately, too much of it. It's difficult to explain to younger football fans just how extraordinary this generation looked when it first came together. David Beckham had become one of the biggest names in world football. Steven Gerrard was dragging Liverpool through matches they had no business winning. Frank Lampard was redefining what an attacking midfielder could produce season after season. Rio Ferdinand and John Terry were considered among Europe's finest defenders. Ashley Cole was facing, and often shutting down, the best wingers in the world. Then there was Wayne Rooney. He wasn't just talented, he looked inevitable. England didn't have one superstar. They had an entire team of them. And that's exactly why expectations became so enormous. Every tournament began with the same headlines. This could be England's year. On paper, it wasn't an unreasonable prediction. If you ranked players position by position, England could compete with almost anyone. So let's consider our first theory. Theory number one, England simply wasn't as good as people remember. At first glance, that sounds ridiculous. But it's worth asking, were these players individually brilliant, or have we exaggerated their greatness because of nostalgia? The evidence doesn't really support that idea. Between them, this group won multiple Premier League titles, Champions League trophies, domestic cups, individual awards. Many captained some of the biggest clubs in the world. Several are regularly included in all-time Premier League X's. These weren't players who merely showed potential. They consistently performed at the highest level in club football. So I think we can probably eliminate our first theory. England wasn't overrated. The talent was real. Which immediately creates an even bigger mystery. If the players really were that good, why didn't it work? That brings us to theory number two. And it's probably the explanation you've heard more than any other, the tactics. Because if you ask almost any England supporter from that era what went wrong, eventually two names always come up, Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard. If you've ever watched a debate about England's golden generation, you've almost certainly heard this sentence. Gerrard and Lampard could never play together. It's become football folklore. The argument goes something like this. Both players were at their best driving forward. Both wanted freedom. Neither was naturally suited to sitting deep and controlling the tempo. So England tried to squeeze two world-class players into roles that prevented either from playing their best football. It's a compelling theory, and there is evidence to support it. Steven Gerrard was the heartbeat of Liverpool. Everything flowed through him. When Liverpool needed inspiration, Gerrard demanded the ball. Frank Lampard played a different role at Chelsea, but he was just as influential. His timing into the penalty area became legendary. Season after season, he produced goal numbers that most midfielders could only dream about. Neither player became great by limiting themselves. They became great because their clubs built systems around what they did best. England didn't have that luxury. International managers had only a handful of training sessions before major tournaments. Instead of months to develop chemistry, they had days. On the surface, that sounds like a convincing explanation, until you start asking one uncomfortable question. Why was England the only country facing that problem? Spain somehow found room for Xavi, Iniesta, Xabi Alonso, David Silva, Sergio Busquets, and Cesc Fabregas. Germany regularly blended elite midfielders without asking whether they could coexist. France has spent decades fitting extraordinary talent into the same squad. Those teams had difficult tactical decisions too, yet we rarely describe them as impossible puzzles. So maybe the problem wasn't simply having two great midfielders. Maybe something deeper was happening. Let's look at another clue, club football. Think about where England's biggest stars came from. Manchester United, Liverpool, Chelsea, Arsenal. These weren't just different clubs, they were bitter rivals. For 9 months every year, these players were trying to beat each other, winning league titles, knocking each other out of cup competitions, fighting for European places. The rivalries weren't manufactured by television, they were real. Now imagine walking into the England dressing room. Yesterday, the player beside you was the opponent standing between your club and a championship. Today, you're expected to trust him completely. Professional athletes are absolutely capable of doing that. But trust isn't built overnight. Trust is built through repetition, shared experiences, success, failure, thousands of hours together. International football doesn't provide that. Players arrive, train for a few days, then they're expected to perform against the best national teams on earth. So here's another theory. Maybe England never had enough time together to become more than the sum of its parts. Again, it's persuasive, but it still doesn't completely satisfy me, because other countries faced exactly the same calendar. Italy's players came from fierce rivals. Spain's stars represented Barcelona and Real Madrid, arguably the biggest rivalry in world football. Germany's squad wasn't assembled in a laboratory either, yet those teams repeatedly looked more connected than England. So if tactics aren't the complete answer, and club rivalries aren't the complete answer, what's left? Here's where I think the investigation becomes really interesting. Because I don't believe England's biggest opponent was another football team. I think it was expectation. And unlike tactics, you can't draw that on a whiteboard. Unlike chemistry, you can't build it in a week. Expectation changes the way people think. It changes the decisions they make. And sometimes, it changes who they become. Before we go any further, consider this. When was the last time England entered a major tournament with low expectations? It's hard to remember, isn't it? Every generation has carried the burden of 1966. Every squad has been told that it could be the one to end decades of waiting. That sounds motivating, but what if it isn't? What if carrying an entire nation's hopes onto the pitch isn't an advantage? What if it's a handicap? Because the more I looked at England's golden generation, the more I started wondering whether pressure, not tactics, was quietly shaping every decision they made. And once I started looking through that lens, a lot of things suddenly began to make sense. Pressure is one of those things that's difficult to measure. You won't find it on a stat sheet. There's no percentage for it, no heat map, no expected goals model. But ask almost any elite athlete and they'll tell you the same thing. The higher the expectations, the harder it becomes to play naturally. Think about England before almost every major tournament. The headlines weren't asking whether England could compete, they were asking whether this was finally the team that would bring football home. Every training session was analyzed, every lineup became a national debate, every mistake became tomorrow's back page. Now compare that to countries that quietly arrived, played their football, and let the tournament unfold. England rarely had that luxury. The pressure didn't begin with the first whistle, it began months before the tournament even started. And when pressure becomes constant, something subtle happens. Players stop trying to create moments. They start trying not to make mistakes. That's a completely different mindset. But here's where I want to challenge that theory too. Because if pressure alone explained England's failures, Brazil wouldn't have won 5 World Cups. Argentina wouldn't carry the weight of an entire footballing nation every 4 years. Real Madrid wouldn't keep winning Champions Leagues with the whole world expecting them to do exactly that. Great teams also face enormous pressure. So once again, pressure explains part of the story, not all of it. By now, we've tested 3 popular theories: the tactics, the club rivalries, the pressure. Each one helps explain England's story. None of them fully explains it. So here's the question that changed my perspective. What if we've been looking at England completely backwards? What if the question was never, how do we fit all these stars into one team? What if it should have been, what kind of team are we trying to become? There's a huge difference. The first question starts with individuals. The second starts with identity. And when I started comparing England to the most successful international teams of the modern era, one pattern kept appearing. Spain didn't become great because they had Xavi and Iniesta. They became great because everyone understood how Spain wanted to play. Germany's identity survived different managers, different generations, even disappointing tournaments. Italy has reinvented itself over decades while still feeling unmistakably Italian. The badge came first. The players adapted to it. England often felt like it worked the other way around. Every manager inherited incredible players and then tried to build a system around them. Instead of players adapting to an identity, the identity kept changing to fit the players. That's a much harder foundation to build on. And I think there's one moment that captures this perfectly. Whenever England lost, the conversation almost immediately became, who should have started? Who should have been dropped? Which formation should they have used? The discussion always returned to individuals. Meanwhile, when countries like Spain or Germany struggled, the conversation was often about the team's performance as a whole. That difference matters, because it reveals how each nation viewed football. One focused on names, the other focused on identity. Now, to be fair, no single explanation is ever enough. Football is too complicated for that. England undoubtedly suffered from difficult draws, injuries, penalty shootouts, moments that could have gone differently. Had one or two of those moments changed, we might remember this generation completely differently. History is full of tiny moments that reshape legacies, so I don't think it's fair to say England failed because of one fatal flaw. But if I had to decide which explanation the evidence supports most strongly, this is where I land. I don't believe England's greatest problem was tactics, or Gerrard and Lampard, or pressure. I think those were symptoms. The deeper issue was that England spent years trying to build the perfect collection of players instead of building the strongest collective identity. Because talent wins matches, but identity wins tournaments. And that's a lesson that reaches far beyond football. Look at the best organizations, the best military units, the best businesses, the best sports dynasties. They all have talented people, but what separates them isn't talent alone. It's that everyone understands the mission, the culture, the role they play within something bigger than themselves. England had extraordinary individuals, some of the greatest the country has ever produced. But when I look back at that generation, I don't see 11 players pulling in the same direction. I see 11 brilliant careers trying to become one team. Sometimes they succeeded, often they didn't. And maybe that's why this generation still fascinates us today. Not because they lacked greatness, but because they proved that greatness alone isn't enough. So I'll leave you with one question. If you were building an international team from scratch, would you choose the 11 best players, or would you choose the 11 players who fit one idea perfectly? Because history suggests those aren't always the same thing, and maybe that's the real story behind England's golden generation. The scoreboard tells us they never won, but the story behind the scoreboard reminds us why. If you enjoyed this investigation, subscribe to Beyond the Box Score. Every episode, we examine the biggest debates in sports, test the evidence, and uncover the stories that statistics alone can never explain. Until next time, keep looking beyond the box score.